Hello everyone, welcome. My name is Richard Westwood from St Anne's Church in Chasetown, and I'm delighted to be joined by Chris Hawthorne, who's one of the team of ministers in St Anne's. He's a licensed lay reader, and Chris is going to be helping us today in our midweek message, the Big Bible Questions series that we've been starting in the last few weeks. And today, Chris is going to be helping us think through some of the different kinds of literature, the different kinds of writing that we come across in the Bible, and help us to understand those different kinds of writing as well. The word he'll use, I'm sure he'll explain, is about the different genre of writing that we come across in the Bible and how we best understand and interpret the Bible as a result of the kind of writing that we have. So, Chris, thank you for doing all the hard work that you have in preparing for this talk. Chris is going to bring to us this teaching as a talk rather than a conversation. So I'll disappear in a moment, and I hope that Chris will enjoy giving the talk and that we'll learn lots as we listen and watch. Chris, over to you. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Chris Hawthorne, and this is week 2 of our journey into the Big Bible Questions. And in week 2, I'm looking at the different types of literature that we can find in the Bible. A very common word for this, which we use when we're teaching English, is the word genre. And the word genre means a type or a style of writing. And it's a word that we may not always know, but we're quite used to it because we know of children's writing, we know of romance fiction, romance films, we know about stories which are horror stories where we go from the known to the unknown, or science fiction stories which are really what if there were aliens out there and we met them. We know about western and crime and thrillers, all sorts of different styles, genres of writing. And what's useful about understanding about the word genre is that when you approach a particular text, a piece of writing, a film, a Bible book, if you know what genre it is, then you begin to understand what the writer's purpose was when it was being written. There are lots of ways that we can look at the Bible. We can look at the social historical context, which is always important. What period of time was it written in? What was happening in that period of time? We can look at the purpose or purposes that the writer may have had. But today I am looking particularly at the idea of genre. There are quite a number of types of writing, different types of genres that we will be looking at. We could have a look at and shall have a look at history, law, wisdom, poetry, gospels, prophecy, epistles, apocalyptic literature, and we'll explore each of these briefly. So to begin with, I'm going to look at the type of writing that we call law. One of the great covenants to the Israelites is the law, God's covenant to the Israelites, his agreement, his special relationship with them. And it was designed, the law was designed to help and protect and guide God's people. Most of us know about the 10 Commandments, God's promises to Moses and the Israelites that having rescued them from Egypt, he will show them his expectations and they will be protected and they will be blessed by God himself. But if they fail to keep the law, he will discipline them. Now we find law in both the Old and the New Testaments. For Christians, we would say that Jesus is the fulfillment of the law, and he has a famous summary of the law and the prophets, which is love God and love your neighbour as yourself. That's read in Mark chapter 12, verses 30 and 31. But actually, when Jesus said this, he's simply quoting Deuteronomy 4 and Leviticus 9. So Jesus was clearly a biblical scholar himself. He knew his Hebrew Bible. Traditionally, the first 5 books of the Old Testament are what we would call the books of law, the Torah. They are supposed to have been written by Moses, although modern scholars would say that there are several schools of writing found in the Torah. It's important to think about the law in terms of social historical context as well. There will be laws that you could dig out and find and you would scoff, raise your eyebrows, be surprised. We simply ignore them. For example, it's a law that you don't wear clothing made out of mixed fibres. Nobody nowadays would say, oh, that's an acrylic and wool mix, I can't wear it, or at least nobody that I'm aware of would feel that way. Laws about eating pork. Pork is a meat that can go off very quickly, and in days when there weren't freezers and refrigerators, they simply avoided eating pig meat because it could go off and make you ill. There were laws to do with slavery and how you should treat slaves, laws to do with marriage and how a man should treat his wife. Many of those we would, at the very least, question today. We don't have slaves, so we don't need laws about slavery. So the social historical context is important. History, with the word story in that word, his story, history, is another type of writing. History is based around the idea of narrative, of stories. And we're very used to that. I'm sure at primary or secondary school you were told, a story has a beginning, a middle and an end. And there are plenty of stories that we can read in the Bible, epic stories, huge stories, the Exodus, the rescue of the Israelites from Egypt, the story of Joseph and his brothers, and how they tried to kill him, but he was rescued and taken off to Egypt, and then he rescued them. There are sort of examples of adventure stories and thrilling stories like David and Goliath, or strange stories like Jonah and the huge fish or the whale. And there are some very intimate stories like the story of Ruth. The thing about stories and history is that the themes are universal, that the themes always remain something that you can recognise. So you might read a story like the book of Ruth and her struggles, her isolation and eventual marriage as something where you think, yes, I too have struggled. I've been very lonely, very isolated. I felt as though I was in a different place and didn't really know everybody. And that is a theme like love, like hate, like anger, hope, blessings that we can all relate to. Wisdom is another type of writing. I quote from the book of Ecclesiastes, "Two are better than one, because if either of them falls down, one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls down and has no one to help them up." Now this really is just at one level a piece of common sense, and it illustrates how the book of wisdom, or the books of wisdom, share helpful points and remind us about how being thoughtful and steadfast can help us to have a better life. The wisdom books seek to build a practical theology for day-to-day living, a godly life in a complicated world. And they use down-to-earth and practical ideas and tone, and usually they just make a sensible point that godly living involves a solid, common-sense set of choices. Wisdom literature is found in the Old Testament, and traditionally King Solomon, the very wise King Solomon, is seen as a writer. When things are difficult politically, and over the last 20 or so years we've had plenty of examples when things have been difficult politically. Here's a particular quote I like: "When the righteous flourish, the people rejoice, but when the wicked rule, the people groan." Poetry is a favourite kind of writing for many Bible readers. And I think of poetry as being a little bit like concentrated thought, concentrated words. It's a bit like drinking Ribena without any water, or having a glass of whiskey or a glass of brandy without having the ginger ale or the water or soda water or whatever to make it watered down a bit, not quite so strong. Poetry is strong and powerful. And poetry uses all sorts of literary devices and techniques, things we all know about, like metaphors and similes, imagery, irony, juxtaposition. When Paul Simon sang, "I am a rock, I am an island," we know that he doesn't think he's a rock, a literal lump of stone. We know that he's saying, I feel as though I'm isolated, I'm isolating myself from other people, I'm an island. But we also know behind that there is an irony, because what he's actually saying is, I feel as though I'm a rock, I'm frightened of meeting people, and yet we have no choice. We are social beings. We have to relate to one another, even though we may feel somewhat isolated. Now, one of the biggest books in the Bible is the book of Psalms, and King David traditionally wrote the book of Psalms. And when in Psalm 23 he famously says, the Lord is my shepherd, or when in Psalm 91 he says, I will say of the Lord, he is my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. Or in Psalm 139 David writes, you have searched me, Lord, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. In each of these quotations we are seeing images, pictures, word images of God. God as a shepherd who cares for his flock. Or God is our refuge, our place of safety. Or you know me. God is omniscient, he is all-knowing, but he's also our friend. Poetic writing appeals primarily to our emotions. Poetry doesn't try to build complex philosophical arguments, but rather it uses images to convey its meanings. It paints colourful pictures with words to convey messages loaded with emotional impact. This does not mean that poetry ignores logic or is illogical. It simply means that it focuses, first of all, on our emotions and feelings. Poetry addresses the heart before it addresses the head. Perhaps as Christians, certainly when we go to church and hear the Bible being read, the style of writing we are most familiar with is the Gospel. Matthew, Mark, Luke and John are the 4 books that start the New Testament. And these Gospels, these good news stories, tell us about the life of Jesus. And each Gospel was written by somebody who knew Jesus personally, or written by someone who was taking account of, taking notes from, hearing from one of the disciples. I'm sure you know in Greek the word gospel means good news. So why was Jesus' life, why was the message that Jesus brought to us one of good news? Well, read the Gospels. But we get these eyewitness accounts of Jesus' earthly life and his ministry. The Gospels show some key biographical details about the life of Jesus. They tell us about the parables that he spoke of, his teaching. They tell us about the miracles that he performed and the wise sayings that he gave. Virtually everything we know about Jesus, about his life and his teaching, his ministry and resurrection, is found in the Gospels. Much of the Old Testament is taken up with epistles, and the word epistle is just another word really for a letter. Now, the epistles were written before the Gospels, and in the very, very early days after Jesus had died and had been resurrected, people were struggling. People were trying to figure out what Jesus had been saying, what the message was, what they were supposed to do. Was he the Messiah? What does it mean that he was the Messiah? And there were conflicts between the Gentiles, who were the non-Jews, and the Jewish people. Do we allow Gentiles to become Christians? What does that mean? Do they have to be circumcised? And so on and so forth. And while they were struggling to sort all of this out, they'd be meeting together in a house group, and they would be sitting down and reading the scriptures. But remember, when they were reading the scriptures, they were reading the Old Testament. But they also had to interpret these scriptures and find out, who this Messiah was. What does the Old Testament say about the Messiah? And so sometimes some people, because they were struggling, Paul, Peter, Timothy, John, would write a letter, an epistle, to a group of people in Corinth, in Rome. And so we have these various letters which have been saved. Now remember, it's an obvious point, but it's worth reminding ourselves, there was no television. There was no radio, no newspapers, no social media, no mobile phones. So it took time and effort to sit down and write out an epistle, a letter. And remember too that not everybody was literate. Most people were illiterate. They couldn't read or write. So they would gather together and sit in a room and listen to a letter from Paul. Listen to a letter being read out that Peter had written, or John. And these letters became very precious. And sometimes somebody would think, that was really good, we read this letter, I wish I could read it, and somebody might copy it out and pass it on. And so over the years we have some of those letters and fragments of those letters that have survived, and we've pieced them back together again, and we get our epistles. These letters contained everything from greetings, encouragement, warnings, to instructions and expressions of thanks and affection. And that would depend on who the audience was, why the letter was being written. Another type of writing is prophecy. The social historical context is quite useful and important when you begin to understand prophecy. The prophetic books contain primarily numerous short stories, spoken pieces, preached messages, and they're usually proclaimed by the prophet to either the nation of Israel or to the nation of Judah. Now you may remember that there had been a split and there became two kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah, the north and the south. Israel and Judah in 72 BC found themselves being attacked by the Assyrians, and they were conquered, and the Assyrians conquered much of the Middle East right the way down to Egypt, and that became for a long period of time the Assyrian Empire. That empire eventually faded and the Babylonians came along. Now they deported most of the southern kingdom of Judah back to Babylon. Most of the prophetic writings were written during this particular time, and it shares God's words with the nations. They were difficult times. We know from that Boney M song, which quotes from the Bible itself, by the rivers of Babylon I lay down and wept. And that the prophets tended to try to remind the people that they had been straying away from God's laws, and they would also sometimes foretell what was going to happen in the future if the people continued to sin. They also sometimes contained visions from God, as well as a short narrative section or some symbolic act. The next empire to arise was the Persian Empire. One of the interesting things about King Cyrus was that he allowed the Israelites to return home, and they were scattered around the Middle East, but he said, you can go back to your own place, back to Israel. So much of the prophecy is found in the Old Testament, but a book like Revelation, the very last book of the Bible, is also a book that has prophecies in it. The final genre, the final type of writing I want to look at is what we call apocalyptic writing. Apocalyptic writing uses colourful images and powerful language to share visions that the writer has had. Apocalyptic writing is a more specific type of prophecy. It's a type of literature that warns us of future events, and the future events have a full meaning that is hidden. We don't really fully understand it. It's almost as though it's a secret, and it just gives us a glimpse, a tiny insight into the future. And right now we don't fully understand them, but over time the true meaning will be flushed out, will become apparent. Apocalyptic writing is found in Isaiah and Daniel, Ezekiel, Zechariah, and, as I have said, in Revelation. But it's worth remembering that lots of people have written lots of books about apocalyptic writing and the end times, and trying to find out, I've worked out that the world will come to an end in 1999 or whatever. The Bible is very clear. We do not know. We know not either the time nor the date. So whilst it's interesting, it's something that you don't want to get too involved in terms of trying to tease out and stress out what the secret is. In our Big Bible Questions, we are trying to help people think about why and how we read the Bible. And there are many answers to that question. You might read the Bible to learn, or to listen to God. You might be seeking comfort and support, or to find answers to a particular question you wish to resolve. You might simply read the Bible to grow closer to God through the Holy Spirit. We simply hope that while we're looking at the big Bible questions, we will be able to help you on your big Bible journey. I hope looking at genre has been one little step along the way for you. Take care. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.